Find yourself in a spot where you're like, yeah, I think I've arrived spiritually. I think I've cracked the code on being a Christian. I think I've figured this thing out, right? Like, my life's going well. I'm reading my Bible every day. I really feel like I've figured this out. If you've ever got to that point, if you've ever looked and said, you know what? I'm not perfect, but I'd never do that. You know what? I'm not the greatest guy in the world, but I know I would never do that. I would never commit that sin. If we ever get to that point, chapter 12, verse 10. Paul said this. He says, that is why for Christ's sake I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul is saying when I'm at my weakest, when I truly understand my weaknesses, that's when I'm strong because I'm really relying on the strength of Christ. I'm not relying on my strength. I tend to be self-sufficient. And when we tend to be self-sufficient, we end up finding ourselves most time headed toward a great fall. But when we uniquely understand our weaknesses, we can't help but rely on Jesus. When we understand who we are, at the core of who we are, we can't help but rely on Him and His strength. So Peter overestimated his own strength, but I also think he overestimated the pull of the crowd. People that arrested Jesus, he's standing there with them, warming himself by the fire with these people. So when it gets tough, right, when the crowd isn't pro-Jesus, and when it gets hard, he folds. He backs away. But I wonder how many of us have done the same thing. We make a commitment on Sunday, and then Monday comes around, and we get around people who aren't necessarily for that commitment. That commitment gets tested, and then we end up in his teaching. I've spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. So we see this denial, first denial by Peter, and now we get to the questions that are asked to Jesus. And Jesus answers very clearly. He's being, cautious. I'm speaking openly here. I've taught openly. You should ask somebody what I've said. If you want to know what I've taught, ask the crowd. They've all heard. These people. This isn't being difficult here, but rather Jesus understands the law, and he's going back to what his legal rights were. See, Jewish law states for a fair trial to happen, the high priest would have to call on witnesses in order for this to be a fair trial. Okay? Having a trial is not unheard of, but in order for it to be a fair trial, a couple things was happening at night. So Jewish law states it couldn't have happened at night. Witnesses. Okay, and that's what Jesus is saying. He goes, if you want to know what I've been taught, if you want to know what I've said, bring witnesses in. Bring people in, because I haven't said these things in secret. But obviously they're not here for a fair trial. Jesus knew the law, and that's what he's calling for. Now look at their response. Verse 22, when Jesus said this, commanded, if I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So Jesus was slapped in the face essentially for asking for his legal rights to happen, essentially asking for a fair trial. Asking for a fair trial. So this interrogation really goes nowhere, so Annas sends him off to Caiaphas. And now John transfers now from this part back to Peter. So it goes from the interrogation back to Peter. Look at verse 25. It says, meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there, warming himself. So they asked him, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? He denied. Here Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow. So here's Peter warming himself by the fire. A relative of Knox is a guy whose ear he cuts off. He's like, no, I know that's you because you cut off my cousin's ear, right? Like, he knew, right? He's like, you remember something like that, right? Like, he's like, didn't I see you in the garden wielding the sword? And he's like, no, that's not me. Then it says the rooster began to crow. John doesn't give us a lot of detail about Peter's denial here. He's just very plain with it. He's asked 3 times, he denies 3 times. But Matthew gives us a little, says, now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You also were with Jesus of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all. Then he went out to the there. This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it again with an oath. I don't know the man. Wow. That's tough, isn't it? John just says, he goes, no, that's not me. But Matthew gives a detail where the second time he literally says, and gives an oath, know who he is. Verse 73, after a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. So Peter goes from a simple denial, I don't know what you're talking about, to making an oath, swearing that he doesn't know the man. Detail into this and says that when the rooster crowed, Jesus literally locks eyes with Peter in that moment. Could you imagine that? Peter in that moment. I don't even know the man. Rooster crows and Jesus just locks eyes with him. Now we know why it says Peter goes out and he weeps bitterly. And there's no way he comes back from this in his mind. And we see this in Peter's life because Peter goes back to his old life prior to Jesus coming and meeting with him again in John chapter 21. So the second observation, sin gets easier with repetition. Sin gets easier with repetition.